Alberta Primetime with Michael Higgins.
Welcome to Alberta Primetime. Ahead tonight, our Friday panel on Calgary's road forward beyond the latest water crisis. But first, weighing the economic impact of pushing separation.
Mr. Carney's had $85 billion in investment leave the country since he's prime minister. I just don't think that. I think they're consciously trying to sabotage industry here, and I think that actually just the opposite. A free and independent Alberta would create probably a boom.
The key proponent for a referendum on separation appearing on Alberta Primetime Thursday. The group is now actively collecting petition signatures for its question. Do you agree that the province of Alberta should cease to be part of Canada to become an independent state? It has until May 2nd to collect nearly 178,000 signatures. Joining us now from Calgary to pick up the discussion on economic impact is Moshe Lander, an economics professor with Concordia University and a former senior economist for the government of Alberta. Moshe, good to see you, sir. Welcome back.
Hello.
All right, from an economic standpoint, what kind of impact or even consequences would you expect to see coming with an independence referendum in Alberta?
I'll make it very simple for you. Anybody in economics that can put forward an argument for why there should be this question, let alone the results of this question, I'll show you an unemployed economist. There is no compelling argument for why separation would be good for Alberta. And if you can find me micro scenarios where this might work out, I will give you a macro load of ways in which it will go terribly badly for the province.
In driving his Forever Canadian anti-separation petition, Thomas Lukaszuk would often point to businesses and investment fleeing Quebec. How would you quantify the impact of referendum talk and debate back a while ago in that province?
If you look at the last 25 years in Quebec, GDP per capita growth has averaged a little more than 1%. Quebec went from being one of the have provinces, the phrase that we use for the richer half of Canada, to being one of the have-not provinces. In fact, it's one of the sources of frustration for a lot of Albertans that are pro-separation, is that they feel that somehow we are propping up Quebec. When that separation referendum went ahead, businesses ran, and it created uncertainty, instability, and nobody wanted to be part of an independent Quebec. And not only was it bad for business, but it was also bad for people. If all of a sudden you risk losing your Canadian passport, your currency, your job prospects, and introduce instability into your life. Look, we just came out of 2025, which was nothing but insecurity and instability triggered by the White House. We're now going to do it to ourselves and expect that people are going to want to hang around. So beyond just businesses leaving, individuals will leave too. And so that's going to erode the tax base from all sides and increase the cost for anybody that's left behind trying to run the province.
Were those impacts felt long ago or even post-referendum in Quebec? How long were the effects felt?
So the thing is that it accumulates over time, right? When you're growing at 1% and a little bit per year and the rest of the country is growing at 2%, you don't notice it instantaneously, right? If you get a 2% raise and I get a 1% raise, you and I are not going to notice that fundamentally our incomes have pulled apart. But if you sustain that over 25 to 30 years, it's going to be noticeable because of compounding. That sort of thing accumulates. And so, like I said, Quebec went from being in the top half of the table into the bottom half of the table. And the only reason why it appears to be catching up to Ontario right now is that Ontario has been even more ungovernable for its own issues. But the reality is that Alberta's prosperity is partly because it is part of Canada, not because it would be better off outside of Canada.
Okay, we've started this on the talk of a pro-separation referendum, but would you expect there to be the same kind of dialogue accompanying a referendum on the Forever Canadian question that focuses on Alberta staying in Canada, a question that essentially still weighs the element of independence?
Yeah, because there's always the risk then that that question goes the wrong way. And so when you're asking the question, I'm always of the belief, never ask a question unless you're prepared for the answer, or in fact, never ask a question unless you know what the answer is going to be in the first place. So when you start introducing those questions, regardless of whether the default position is we stay in Canada or we leave Canada, you run the risk that the question doesn't go the way you want. And I think back in the 90s when the Quebec referendum was allowed to go ahead, there was this expectation at the time that, oh, there's no way that they're going to vote to separate. And then it was that knife's edge where everybody was staying awake late into the night to see what actually happened. That's the type of thing that creates the unstabilizing outcome for businesses, for individuals. And so even allowing the question in whatever form to go ahead is problematic. But beyond that, neither question is asking for what are the costs and benefits of the decision. To merely just say, do you want to leave or do you want to stay, at what cost or to what benefit, is missing. It would make the question completely impossible to put into a succinct way. But if I ask you, would you like chicken for dinner? Yes or no is very easy. Would you like chicken even though it might come with health risks or even though I might be a bad cook or all these other things? Well, that's a more complicated question in which all of a sudden your yes answer might turn into a no answer. And that's something as simple as asking what you want for dinner. Asking, do you want to stay in Canada without laying out what would be involved in that? That's hugely dangerous then for both sides.
In our interview with Mitch Sylvester, and it was reflected in the clip that we played off the top as well, but he made the suggestion that Alberta independence would potentially create a boom. Are there elements of the economy that would stand to benefit?
No, I don't know what he's talking about, and I don't know what he's basing that on. You could imagine that if Alberta were to leave Canada, you would have to introduce a currency, border control, passports. When you have people racing out the door, how are you going to pay for Alberta pensions? Where's that money going to come from? What's going to happen to the housing market? I don't see that there's a lot of benefits. The thought that somehow you're going to be able to negotiate free passage to the ocean for pipelines with now a Canada that's going to be resentful and a U.S. that's going to have extreme leverage over an independent Alberta is going to be even more complicated. And for all Alberta's frustration with BC and trying to negotiate that pipeline, you're going to have to contend with Washington, Oregon, and California, who are considerably more left of center than BC is traditionally. And so I think it's going to make it even harder to get those pipelines constructed. I don't see where exactly any sector is going to benefit. And don't forget that our provincial government would now become our federal government, so to speak, and they don't know how to balance a budget when they are working within Canada. How are they going to balance a budget when the economy is cratering and everybody's racing for the door or the border?
Well, and you bring up the U.S., so how much of an alignment with the Americans generally would be necessary for an independent Alberta to be viable?
I don't want to give away state secrets. The Americans don't want Alberta. And if they want Alberta, they want us for their oil or for our oil. And guess what? They don't even want us for our oil, given that they just went into a little bit of adventurism in Venezuela. Let's remember that part of Alberta's oil industry growth goes hand in hand with the decline of Venezuela. Up until the turn of the century, before Chavez became president of Venezuela, most of that infrastructure in the American Gulf was built on Venezuelan oil, which is the direct competition for Alberta's oil. Alberta was merely opportunistic in taking advantage of the decline of Venezuela, but now that the U.S. seems to have control over the spigots in Venezuela, do they need Alberta? And if Alberta is separated from the rest of Canada, if we feel that we're not getting a fair share right now with our elbows up trying to retaliate against U.S. tariffs and trade talk, do you think an independent Alberta is going to have any more leverage or any more ability when effectively we become a one-resource economy?
Okay, maybe one last quick question for you, Moshe. There's also been talk of late of a possible independence referendum in Quebec. How do you see that playing with this dialogue in Alberta, especially when you weigh the economic, political uncertainty that comes with the Trump administration's trade war with Canada?
I feel like I'm well positioned here living in Alberta and working in Quebec to deal with this one. There is no benefit for Quebec either going ahead with their referendum, even though it looks like a separatist party is going to outright win the election. The only difference between the two provinces is that Quebec continues to harbor a 350-plus-year-old grievance against English-speaking Canada. It's on the back of their license plates. And so their justification for sacrificing their standard of living and their quality of life is purely in the preservation of cultural and linguistic differences. That doesn't apply in Alberta. So to whatever degree it might make sense to have that referendum in Quebec, which I don't think it does, at least it's built on something more than just they're upset at Ottawa and they feel that somehow they'll take their ball and go home is the solution.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Appreciate your time as always, Moshe. Thank you.
Anytime.
Moshe Lander is an economics professor with Concordia University and a former senior economist for the government of Alberta.